Hello and welcome to the Breaking Muscle podcast, the show that brings you the top minds in the fitness industry who share their knowledge and experience to help motivate and inspire you to take your training to the next level. I'm your host, Tom McCormick, and today I'm joined by Dr. Joel Seedman. With over 15 years of personal and team training, strength coaching and nutritional counselling experience, Joel works with a wide variety of clientele. To maximise performance and health, Joel focuses on improving his clients' muscle function and movement mechanics. By doing this, all characteristics of performance, fitness, and health improve, no matter the athlete or training goal. In this episode, we dive deep on what causes muscles to grow, the role of genetics on muscle and strength gains, the benefits of eccentric isometrics, factors that might be inhibiting your progress, and that Joel is the most interesting man on the planet. So, without further delay, it's on with the podcast. All right, Joel, so thanks so much for taking the time today to talk to us and help enlighten us all a little bit about training and how we can optimize our performance. Before we get cracking with the geeky stuff on training side of things, can you give us a little bit of a background about how you got into training and your path into the fitness industry?
Yeah, definitely. First off, thanks for having me on the show. I didn't know we were trying to schedule this. It's always good to do this. I've been in the industry for, I guess, coming up to, about 16 years now. So, I've been, doing kind of a combination of the hands-on training and the education for pretty much as long as I can remember. I started hands-on training when I was 18, which is actually the same exact time I started my studies at the university.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really allowed me over the years to essentially be able to take the information that I learned and apply it to my clients and apply it to my training and what I do with my athletes. So it's been pretty cool because it's not just a matter of let me do what I read in the magazines or let me just study in the lab and just kind of look at things in the research. But I've been able to kind of take the two aspects of the science and the practical and essentially merge them. Right now I have my own business, Advanced Human Performance, and it's pretty cool because I get to work with a lot of athletes. Also work with a lot of general populations and, write a lot. Had a book that came out recently, Movement Redefined, talks a lot about eccentric isometrics, how to optimize performance, muscle growth, fitness, health, you name it. So, it's been a good journey so far. And I love this field. I don't think I can really, picture myself doing anything else. So, it's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. So you found your passion, as it were, then.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and was it growing up? Were you always a sporty kid? You enjoyed playing sport, or is it something that came a little later?
Yeah, I think the sports thing has always been, kind of in the family.
Mm-hmm.
My parents, my siblings. So sports was always something that kind of drove the whole, strength training side of things because I really got into the strength training aspect. Even when I was a young kid, you see all these muscular guys in the magazines or on TV, and you're like, oh, I want to look like them. And then, it kind of leads you into this path. And when I was, I guess about 14 is when I really started to strength train because I was sick of being, wimpy looking or, being picked on or just even having, for me, even early on, I was 14, 15 years old. I had a lot of injuries. I had scoliosis I had to deal with. My body was even at that age, it's kind of weird as I look back. I had a lot of just, joint issues. So in reality, it was kind of a blessing in disguise because, essentially it forced me to kind of go down this path and troubleshoot my own body. And as a result, I've been able to help clients and athletes that I deal with because it's been issues that I've had to overcome and struggles that I've had to deal with. So it's been pretty cool. And that's one of the things that I focused on with the research is not just what's the best way to optimize, the hypertrophy mechanisms, the muscle growth, the strength, but also what's the best way to maximize physiological performance and biomechanics and joint health and all that stuff, because that plays just as important of a role, not just long-term health, but even athletic performance, because a lot of people try to kind of separate the health and performance side of things, but they really go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. They're two sides of the same coin type thing. I think it's important, as you say, to take that holistic approach. Some guys get caught chasing performance, they end up unhealthy, and being unhealthy is a quick way to end up giving up your performance ability. Also, interesting, you talk about you train like a broad spectrum from athletes to general pop. So
obviously within that, we're probably looking at a broad spectrum of sort of genetic potential. So, those elite athletes, they got some stellar genetics, obviously, that help them achieve, along with their hard work, where they've got to. So one thing I want to talk about is the impact of genetics upon someone's muscle and strength potential and the progress they can make, and if there's any different programming considerations that you take into account based on that.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. I think there's, I think the genetic thing is always a tricky topic because everyone always wants to think, hey, screw genes, hard work, and I can get wherever my body wants to, and nothing's impossible, and whatever we put our minds to. Unfortunately, when it comes to muscle growth and strength and hypertrophy and even athletic performance, there's a lot that is governed by our genetic ceilings. I think one thing, if we're talking about genes and how it impacts our ability to maximize or to grow new muscle, I think the whole fast twitch versus slow twitch thing, I think that's kind of one of the big places you have to start. Genetically, some people are going to have more fast twitch muscle composition. Some people are going to have more slow twitch. If they have more fast twitch, chances are they're going to have a greater potential for building muscle because those are just larger muscle fibers. They're larger motor units. We can have greater ability to overload those. They have greater ability for growth. They have greater ability to produce force. So, when you talk about that, that's definitely one of the big things right there. If you take someone who's predominantly slow twitch, who's great at endurance activities, obviously we can do a lot to still improve their strength and still improve their size, but they're obviously going to have a little bit lower of a genetic ceiling in terms of, optimizing that growth and their growth capabilities. But, the funny thing is there's actually some research showing that perhaps maybe 30-40% of our muscle fibers can kind of go one way or another. So it's not just set in stone completely. Obviously, the various forms of physical activity and, sports and the way we train and all that can obviously have a pretty big impact, but it's probably not as big as the actual genetic factor in terms of what we're born with. So I think that's a pretty big first place to start.
Yes, absolutely. I think you have to accept the cards you're dealt, and then you kind of think of it like a poker analogy, or whatever. You get the cards, then you play the game the best you can.
Wow.
Actually interesting you say, I was having not so much a debate, but someone commented on social media to one of my posts about, it's just hard work. If I work hard on anyone, I can do anything. And my point was, well, I could do all the training in the world, but I'm not running the 100 meters faster than Usain Bolt. And likewise, I'm never going to look like Phil Heath, regardless of pharmaceutical assistance or whatever. So really important to understand that genetics are a huge factor. But by the same token, they're not like a death sentence to your gains. There's still a huge scope for doing things and making huge progress. So when you're working with someone, do you consider ways of trying to estimate their fiber type or anything like that, or is it you kind of work with them for a while and you kind of get a vibe with what works best for them?
Yeah, actually, I used to, and I still do to an extent. I try to figure out what an athlete's more suited to in terms of whether they're more slow twitch or fast twitch. But in reality, I don't let it dictate the training too much because there's certain ways and certain protocols that, regardless of whether you're more slow twitch, fast twitch, different physiological attributes, there's certain things that we can do when it comes to strength training that it's going to maximize the hypertrophy and strength mechanism regardless. So obviously there's, I guess if I'm going to change one thing, I think the recovery capacity for individuals is going to differ, and that's where I may change the volume a little bit, may change the intensity, may change, the amount of rest between sets. Some people just have better recovery capabilities than others. Some people are more hard gainers in their ability to recover and recuperate from an intense workout. That may be a little bit less. So I think in terms of modifying workouts, I think that's the main thing. I don't necessarily say, oh, well, this person is, more slow twitch, so we're going to do higher reps. Because in reality, too much high reps, there's actually some research to show that may not actually be beneficial, just because the ability to actually take some of those fast twitch fibers, which everyone has, it starts to convert over to take on characteristics of slow twitch muscle fibers. When that happens, it definitely starts to minimize our ability to grow muscle. So
yeah. Okay, I agree with that. And actually, an interesting thing. So I've heard people talk before about trying to bias your training to your, your fiber type, what you're predisposed to. And I've always wondered, the balance between training and bringing up a weakness and then capitalizing on a strength. And there's still that trade-off, it seems to me. So you want to use a broad spectrum of a rep range regardless anyway. It seems to be a bit kind of trying to get too clever for your own good if you like, oh, well, you just do great on 15 reps per set or whatever some people seem to promote. Because you're still leaving untapped potential if you never train those fibers.
Exactly. And even people that are very slow twitch, it's not like they have no fast twitch. I mean, they still may be 60-40 or something like that. So.
Yeah. Good point. Okay, so it seems to me that what we've established is that there's difference between people's starting point and their potential, but the principles behind how you're going to set up a training plan are largely the same. We're different. We're not that different from person to person.
Exactly.
So on that basis, then, given the underlying principles are the same for everyone, what are the causes of muscle and strength gain? What really drives the adaptations that we're all trying to get out of our training?
Yeah, so I think I have a kind of my own way that I like to look at the muscle hypertrophy response and ways that you can maximize that. I kind of like to group it into 3 different buckets. Mm-hmm. The first one is kind of that direct hypertrophy stimulation. We look at things, there's I guess several key mechanisms for triggering muscle hypertrophy or direct mechanisms. We can look at, mechanical tension, which is essentially, how much tension, how much force is directly placed upon the muscle. Obviously, overload plays a pretty integral factor and component when we talk about that. But also, it's not just overload, because you can take a heavy weight, and if you're not, adequately using the muscles, or you're not using the muscles properly, or using lousy form and using a lot of momentum, there's actually not going to be a ton of tension on the muscle. So it has to be quality tension combined with that high levels of mechanical tension and force. And then, we can look at muscle damage, or eccentric muscle damage, also known as micro trauma. That's another, kind of classic one that people always think of. Oh, I lift weights, I, tear my muscles down, and then they grow back bigger and stronger. So that's kind of your, classic. And then we got another one, metabolic stress, which is similar to kind of cellular swelling or cellular volumization. Basically, that one's related to more time under tension. Also, what people commonly think of as the burn, mm-hmm. or, they pump going, and that's typically associated with higher rep ranges, and even a little bit shorter rest periods as well. So, but those are kind of the 3 big ones, and those are the big direct ones. But then, we can even get into some of the indirect mechanisms, and even I personally like to look at factors that can inhibit the muscle growth process, and what we can do to actually minimize those inhibiting factors, because there's actually quite a few of those as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, interesting. So I think most people are probably aware of those 3 direct mechanisms that sort of Brad Schoenfeld popularized: mechanical tension, muscle damage, and metabolic stress. And actually, your interesting point you had on overload, I think, is really key, because a lot of people seem to just think it's load on the bar. But actually, one way I've heard it described is people talk about progressive tension overload. And so, just trying to find ways to increase tension, because that's what we're really looking for, which is a concept I think that some people get confused about. But finding a way to challenge the muscle more is still an overload. It's just, a different way of looking at it. And I've found that hugely beneficial, both in my training and people I work with, when we actually find a way to make their muscles do more work, rather than just saying, I've put 2.5 kilos or 5 pounds on the bar and bounced it from A to B. What I'd love to get a bit of insight into is those inhibitory factors. I think that's something that's not so often talked about, and I'm sure piqued the interest of a few listeners who are like, "Oh, I've never heard this before." So can you expand on that a little bit? Yeah,
this actually goes back a little bit to the discussion we were just having on genes and genetic factors, and kind of gearing things to the if they were slow twitch, doing more high reps. So there's actually some research now that shows that too much of that metabolic stress, that we just talked about as being kind of that third mechanism of muscle hypertrophy. So first off, that's probably the less extreme or the least effective of all the hypertrophy mechanisms. Probably mechanical tension and muscle damage are a little bit more impactful and powerful. But the third one being that metabolic stress, there's research showing that if there's actually too much metabolic stress, too much fatigue, too much ATP expenditure, it can actually inhibit the mTOR pathway, which the mTOR pathway is just basically triggering protein synthesis. And in order to grow new muscle, we have to trigger protein synthesis. So essentially, too much fatigue, too much burn, too much just exhaustion and metabolic stress during a workout, it can actually have that inhibition response. And we're really talking to not just, oh, well, I'm going to do a high intensity cardio workout. I'm talking about during a period where we're trying to trigger that hypertrophy mechanism, such as during a strength training workout. If we have too much high reps or too much of that burn going on, it can actually interfere with the muscle building process.
Wow. Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And like from an anecdotal perspective, what I found is that the metabolic stress approach is really effective, but it's really effective for short periods of time. And perhaps that's exactly why for a month where you're pushing it, it's great. But if you're someone who's always just training for the pump, maybe as you say, it's due to those inhibitory factors, and that negative consequence there.
Exactly. So it's, you see all these routines, especially at, a lot of these world-class bodybuilders do, everything is 20 sets of 10 to 20 reps and all these high rep ranges, which, when you're talking about the hypertrophy, trigger and the ability to build muscle mass, whether or not the person is, geared and doing it illegally or doing it with, steroids, and whether or not they're natural, that's also a big thing. But those high reps and those large volume protocols, if you're natural, that is definitely not the best way to maximize muscle growth. It's probably going to be a little bit more using lower reps and keeping the volume down a little bit. And like we just talked about, making sure you're not having too much of that metabolic stress. And obviously when we start training too much for the metabolic stress, we're sacrificing some of those other components that would be directly geared towards mechanical tension and muscle damage, because we'd be using lighter weights anyways. It kind of, for me personally, I like to rely a little bit on a lower rep range or a moderate rep range when I'm training clients. And I think we can get into the whole, technique components and optimizing biomechanics, but that's one of the other reasons that I do that. But
okay, well, so let's quickly dive in with then for like, if you could give some cliff notes and guidelines of how you would have someone train, like an overview of the structure in terms of sets and reps, or the ranges you prefer to work in, especially for like, if we're focusing on natural guys there, and then we'll dive into some of the other stuff a little later on. Yes.
So yeah, no, I people are always pretty surprised that I usually recommend a 2 to 6 rep range. I would say 80% of what I do with my athletes and clients involves that rep range. Now, and we'll probably get into this in a little bit too, I use predominantly eccentric isometrics with my clients, and that's one of the things that I studied when I was doing my research, and it's one of the things that I've kind of really focused on over the years, not just because I'm trying to come up with a cool term to sales pitch and all that, but it's because I truly believe it kind of holds all the key factors that optimize the hypertrophy and strength building mechanisms. And so the eccentric isometrics, it's a lot more time under tension per repetition, because we're doing about a 3 to 5 eccentric contraction. We're also holding in the stretched position for another 2 to 5 seconds. And then obviously on the way up, we're being pretty explosive. So each rep, instead of doing, 2 seconds per rep, it's more like 7 to 8 seconds. So the time under tension for a set of 5 reps is actually longer than what most people's 10 to 15 is. So when I do those low rep ranges, it really not only helps build that muscle hypertrophy, and we can also build those fast twitch muscle fibers, but it allows the individual to really focus on their form and body mechanics, because it's not like they have endless reps they have to kind of pace themselves for or sandbag it at the beginning of the workout, but they can really go all in and treat each rep like its own individual set, rather than, oh man, I got to do 10 reps. Like, no, take 1 rep at a time, maximize it, crush it, really dial it in with perfect mechanics, move on to the next rep, because you don't have too many of them, so you don't have to worry about blowing yourself out.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So one thing I tell people is every rep is a growth opportunity, and the way you're structuring it there, it kind of it laser focuses that for the client or the athlete, that they can't escape that, because they're only going to do 2 to 6. They better make sure they all count. Now, so the 2 to 6 rep range. Now, obviously, you work with a lot of guys who their bias may be towards performance and hypertrophy comes alongside that. If you were focusing on someone who just wanted to get as big as possible, would you shift things at all, or would you still stick with that 2 to 6 rep range?
So I would still use the 2 to 6 rep range as the foundations of the training, but I would definitely throw in some higher reps, especially as we just talked about, like towards the end of workout, maybe the last 10 minutes, doing some finishers, doing some isolation movements. But as far as the big compound movements, which really have the most potential for building growth and strength anyways, especially for natural lifters, their squats, their presses, their pull-ups, their rows, they're going to still be a pretty low rep range. We may not do quite as much of that 2 or even 3. It may be more like the 4 to 6 and periodically maybe hitting 8 on the last set. And then at the end, I may throw in some very high rep finishers, maybe some drop sets, maybe some forced reps with, whether it's bicep curls, lateral raises, some leg extensions. But as far as on the big compound movements, not too much with the higher reps. I think a lot of people think that you have to really just overhaul the training depending on the client. And it's true, depending on the client, depending on their goals, it's going to be different. But it's not going to be vastly different because it's still a human body we're dealing with. And there's certain key foundational principles that we want to apply to every human being. And it's going to vary a little bit, but not as much as some people would think.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. So that individualization is a huge element in terms of, it's a significant element if you're trying to optimize your results, but it's nowhere near as big as making sure that your training is specific to the goal and you're progressively overloading and the movement quality is high and tension's where you need to be and all of those things. Sometimes people kind of put it, I feel, in their programming front and center. They like try and make every exercise different and just special to them. And then you realize that their overall program isn't working towards their actual end goal anyway. And they've got the cart before the horse, for want of a better analogy. Okay, so I'd like to explore the eccentric isometrics a little bit more detail so that people listening are exactly understanding how you program them, how they're performed. So can you walk me through, someone's doing a session and their first exercise is, for example, squats, how that looks?
Yep. So I think the squat's a good one to start with because, in my opinion, that's probably the most butchered of all the classic movements. But so essentially, what I'm going to have them do is slow things down big time. And I think that's the key with the eccentric isometric. So what I'll have them do is I'll have them, get into a kind of a natural stance, but I am going to have them keep a relatively straight foot position. That's something that I really, kind of clash heads with in terms of a lot of coaches out there saying that, you want to pull the toes out and rotate them out. We can talk about why I do that. But anyways, I'll really focus on several big cues. I don't want to give them too many cues because there's only so many things that they can attend to at once. But I'll have them screw their feet down. I'll have them brace their core, keep that neutral spine. And then from there, I'm going to have them go down very slowly. And I'm going to tell them to feel that first natural stopping point. And they're going to hold that for several seconds. So again, probably about a 3 to 5 second negative. Mm-hmm. I'll tell them to feel as they're going down if there's any aberrations in the movement, such as any shifting, such as any wiggling, such as any asymmetrical loading, and then make those adjustments because they're going slow enough that they actually can make the adjustments. And then as they hold it after a few seconds, feel get locked in at that 90-degree position, they'll explode up powerfully but smoothly, reset, and then repeat that cycle for anywhere from, like I said, 2 to 6 reps. And if it's a beginner, a lot of people say, oh, beginners, you got to have them do high reps to ingrain those motor pathways. Man, the reps for beginners, for me, it's oftentimes, it may just be 1 rep per set because I'm going to say, hey, we are going to do 1 perfect rep. I want you to give me everything because it's mentally can be pretty draining. So those eccentric isometrics really allow the individual to hone in on their mechanics. It really allows them to fine tune their movement and their technique and really tune into subtle aspects of biomechanics and even the intramuscular components of activation that they wouldn't normally be able to tune into, because if it's happening too fast, we can't feel anything. If it's happening slowly, we can really get a sense for what's going on. And that's one of the things with my clients and athletes. I like to tell them, hey, I don't want you to rely on me as a coach. I want you to rely on your body's own feedback, its own sensory information, its own proprioception. And then from there, you can make those subtle adjustments because the human eye can only see so much. I can only see so much, okay? But we can feel a lot more than what we can see. And my job, my goal is to get the athlete or the client to the point where they can feel more than what I can see. And at that point, they become the master of their own training, the master of their own body mechanics, and I can take a little bit of a backseat. Obviously, I'm still going to guide it. If I see things get really, amiss, I'll mention things, but it's always kind of guiding them back to, hey, slow it down a little bit, feel it. Do you feel anything get off? Make the adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Yeah, really like that. And a couple of points. First of all, that human eye one you talk about, the coach watching from the outside. Something I think is, for example, is like a hip hinge pattern, like an RDL, can quite often, if you're watching, they can look pretty good, but the client can tell you two drastically different things based on the load or exactly how they're performing that rep. And, if someone watching might think they're exactly the same, but the stimulus they're getting to those muscles is very different. And having that biofeedback is huge for the athlete to ingrain that. And it's a great teaching tool. And actually those eccentric isometrics, I was also thinking as you were describing them, it's a phenomenal teaching tool when someone's learning a movement. Their quality now, if they leave you, they never work with you again, they never do another eccentric isometric, they just do regular speed squats. You can be sure that their normal tempo squat's going to be far better because of that foundation you've given them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. No doubt. It basically, what I like to call it is it kind of rewires their nervous system. It kind of overhauls it and kind of, cleans things up, and it re-educates their nervous system, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, brilliant. And another thing you talked about in terms of having people just do one rep. I think I heard, it was Dave Tate, I heard say this something, but like the more first reps, the better when someone's learning. So, rather than doing a set of three singles means that you're going to get a higher quality. And I think that's a really cool tip for anyone who's starting out to understand is to make sure they're getting really good quality reps. And doing singles to nail and perfect the technique is a great idea.
Exactly.
Also with these eccentric isometrics, when I read your stuff about them and heard about them and thinking about pause reps when I've included them, I think they're a phenomenal tool from injury prevention. Do you think that that's one of their values?
I think that's one of the perhaps the key values of eccentric isometrics. It teaches you to kind of find those optimal biomechanics, those optimal activation patterns, and it teaches you to be able to absorb force and absorb impact optimally. And force absorption, force impact, I don't care whether you're a high-level athlete or an 80-year-old person, you have to be able to absorb force. You can't absorb force. Something is absorbing force, and it's probably going to be your connective tissue, your tendons, ligaments, joints, instead of your muscles. So our job is to get those muscles to do their job, which force absorption is a critical aspect of, our muscles. And a lot of people think of just, producing force, creating more torque. Absorbing it is just as important. That's where the injuries happen. So eccentric isometrics really teach you that, not only because they teach good biomechanics, but because you're spending so much time in the eccentric position. And eccentric is essentially where we're absorbing force from in those, stretched positions, essentially. So, we can talk more about kind of how that even plays into the hypertrophy thing with eccentric isometrics, but no, that's a good question for sure.
Cool. Well, actually going that hypertrophy route is exactly where I was thinking next, because I sadly know people listening are like, oh, cool, I won't get injured, whatever. And they move on. Until you've been injured, you kind of discount that. So they'll maybe learn that lesson the hard way, but it's a valuable one to consider. But the hypertrophy thing, you're increasing the time under tension. Momentum's not a factor. You're making the muscles do the work, not relying on stretch reflex and things. And that, it seems, on a rep by rep basis means it's a far higher hypertrophy stimulus. Presumably, you're in agreement with that.
Exactly. No, and we can look at that. We can look at kind of the deeper physiological elements of that. But even just the standpoint of injury and joint pain and inflammation. There's a lot of research now showing that inflammation, besides being one of the key things that kind of contributes to all these illnesses and pathologies that we see and sickness, inflammation is actually very catabolic, and it really prevents the muscle building process, and it really increases cortisol. It can really start messing with that cortisol testosterone ratio. So when we're blowing ourselves out and we're having joint pain, but it's like, oh no, it's cool, man, because I'm lifting heavy, I'm getting my sets and I'm getting my work in. But if we're beat up, guess what? It's not just something we feel internally and physiologically. We're severely compromising and interfering with the growth process Also because when we're inflamed, it's really decreasing our insulin sensitivity and it's increasing insulin resistance. And when that happens, our ability to absorb nutrients and kind of partition it to the muscles, it's severely compromised as well. So, when we can train hard and we can minimize that inflammation response, not just injury, obviously the injury is a huge part, but be able to take stress off the joints and walk away from workout being like, man, my muscles feel like they got work, my joints feel awesome. I don't feel like pain, I'm not overly sore. That is a great combination and a great equation there to just really optimize strength, hypertrophy, and performance, and just overall health as well.
Yeah, 100%. So would you say, we're talking about those inhibitory factors earlier, that inflammation is one of the biggest inhibitory factors of muscle gain?
Exactly, and that's one of the reasons why I believe that eccentric isometrics are so important, because that inflammation is a key one, and I think it's one that so many lifters, so many athletes don't tune into. They just kind of accept it as a normal part of the how they're going to feel. And there's a lot of research showing that even just a few minor kind of nagging areas of the body, if you look at C-reactive protein, which is a measure of inflammation in the body, is actually elevated pretty substantially when we're even just dealing with some small things. It doesn't even have to be like huge injuries. So again, kind of minimizing that inflammation, and the eccentric isometrics, to me, that's one of the most effective ways to do that. But I think another cool thing about the eccentric isometric protocol, like we talked about with the inhibitory factors, we talked about how that excessive metabolic stress, that excessive fatigue can definitely get in the way. When we look at how muscles function, how they fire, you got the excitation, contraction, coupling process, and that's basically just how the series of contractions works. Okay, it's nothing really fancy. It's just the shortening, the lengthening process, shortening, lengthening, kind of back and forth. It's just how a muscle operates. Well, that is a very metabolically expensive process. It burns a lot of calories. That's how we really get a burn going, so to speak. When we can produce a lot of high tension, we can produce a lot of constant tension, and we can also simultaneously minimize too much metabolic stress because we're not having these repeated series of contractions and we're going slower and spending more time in a lengthened position. Guess what? That's like the ultimate formula for building muscle hypertrophy, because we get the mechanical tension, we get the muscle damage, but we're not having excessive metabolic stress, and we're not failing because our muscles are just giving out to excessive fatigue, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. So you're finding that sweet spot, essentially, of all those things, all those elements, right in the middle. If it's a Venn diagram or whatever, you're absolutely nailing that. Yeah, perfect. I really like them. I think they're a valuable tool. So if someone's thinking about incorporating them into their own programming, how do you go about structuring a session? You said you don't necessarily do all exercises in this fashion. How might a typical session play out for someone?
Yeah, actually, I guess to kind of retrace that a little bit, pretty much these days it really is just about all the in terms of the big compound movements. I like to group it into the big seven. You got your squat, hinge, lunge, your horizontal push and pull, vertical push and pull. So the majority of those are going to be eccentric isometric. Obviously, there's going to be some explosive exercise in there. There may be some plyometrics, some Olympic lifts. We'll throw in some core stabilization, some foot and ankle exercises. But obviously, like I said, those low rep ranges. So we may do 3, perhaps 4 sets of pretty typical compound movements, such as a squat, a row, a press. We may even kind of superset those together so that they can, keep the pace of the workout going without having much local fatigue, but also, getting as much efficiency of the workout in as possible. So we may do, a set of 3 to 5 reps on squats, all of those being eccentric isometrics, rest 1 minute. Maybe you do a row, rest another minute, do the same thing on a chest press. And again, all those are using at least somewhat of whether it's a modified eccentric isometric protocol or a little bit longer one. That may vary to an extent. But yeah, and like I said, keeping the rep ranges a bit lower. But even if we're doing some explosive exercises, like, I use Olympic lifts, decent amount. I use a lot of the hang versions. And if they're doing the hang versions, oftentimes they're still going to be doing eccentric isometric because they can really feel their hips loading back on that hip hinge. They can hold it, and then they can get some really great power output. And it's funny because, you think of, if you take away that stretch reflex and go too slow on the Olympic lifts or on explosive movements on the eccentric, you're going to be minimizing the power effect. I've actually seen particularly when you start working with athletes and cleaning up their technique, when you start using the eccentric isometrics on their explosive movements like their Olympic lifts, they actually have more power because they get into a better position and their biomechanics are better. Now, ultimately, if they were going to test it after they've improved their biomechanics, we probably wouldn't want to do an eccentric isometric. We want to use a little bit more of a stretch reflex. But still, it just shows how important it is to clean up those body mechanics, because it really helps contribute to optimizing those, neural pathways and optimizing biomechanics.
Fantastic. So, two points I want to go on. One is we're talking about the eccentric there and the importance of it. Now, I know that I've seen some videos of you doing this where you actually accentuate the eccentric or an eccentric overload by doing like a 2-in-1 technique or something like that, where you could lower, because obviously you can lower more than you can hold, and you can hold more than you can lift. So you can lower a weight with one hand, for example, depending on the piece of equipment you're using, and then press it with two, so you get a really high level of overload on the eccentric. Can you talk me through that? How beneficial that is, and is it a game changer? Does it add just a small percentage? What's your opinion there?
Definitely. In terms of the growth stimulating response to hypertrophy mechanism, that protocol is extremely effective. I refer to it as the BANA, or the bilateral assisted negative accentuated training protocol. And like you said, all that means is you're basically lifting it with two arms and lowering it with one, because we can essentially handle more weight on the eccentric phase of a movement than we can on the concentric phase. So we're just taking advantage of that eccentric overload or that muscle damage, which also happens to take advantage of that mechanical tension because the loads are so high. So first off, I do use that quite a bit. It's a little harder to dial in the form and mechanics because it is pretty heavy on the eccentric. So it's not going to be quite as much of a game changer for optimizing biomechanics, but it still will be effective. But for strength and hypertrophy, for sure. Now, with that said, you do have to be careful with those eccentric overload protocols, because you can almost tear the muscles down too much, and you can create too much structural damage. And this is actually, I guess, if we're going back to minimizing those inhibitory factors that could kind of interfere with maximizing muscle hypertrophy, I think the excessive muscle damage is actually one that we can talk about, and one that, when I'm programming things like those bilateral assisted negative accentuated protocols, why I don't overdo those, because there's some research showing that if you create too much muscle soreness or too much DOMS or delayed onset muscle soreness, you can actually atrophy a muscle, which is pretty scary. You can work so hard, tear it down so much that it actually doesn't come back as strong, and it can take even months to come back from that. So when you're getting sore for 4, 5, 6 days, that's probably not good. That's probably putting you into a catabolic response, and you're probably not going to gain strength, and you may very well actually lose strength in size. So when people are talking about, oh man, eccentric overload, I'm going to just really crush those eccentrics and go as heavy as possible. Well, you got to use them sparingly. It's going to be tricky to recover from.
Yeah, 100%. So yeah, I think if you overuse them, you basically dig too much of a ditch to get yourself back out of. And as someone who's experimented with them, they are very taxing, and you can, they give, but they also take, and it's getting that ratio right of making sure you get a stimulus and there's a return on your investment. And I think if someone goes in and tries to do their whole workout that way, well, they're probably like, if you're doing a leg workout that way, you won't be walking for a week or two. But so if you're going to incorporate them, how much of a workout do they make up? How do you sort of fit them in?
Yeah, I may choose one movement pattern every few workouts, and we'll do that protocol. So it may be something like a seat table row where we do it on. There's certain variations that are a little bit more taxing than others. Obviously, doing it on a squat or a bench press may be a little bit more taxing. Exercises that involve pressing, typically a little bit more exhausting. Pulling exercises, maybe not quite as much. So we may do 2 to 3 sets of a movement and maybe get 3 to 4 reps on each side of the body. So, because as we said, it's, you're lowering it with one side. So I found that to be kind of the good sweet spot. I don't like to do too many reps on that as well. And you really shouldn't be able to do, 15, 20 reps on that. If you're doing 15, 20 reps, you're defeating the purpose of the whole eccentric overload component. So yeah, I may choose just one exercise per workout. It may be something that we just do even, once or twice a week. It's definitely something that I use, and it's very powerful. You'll definitely see some great gains from it, but you just got to be careful not to overdo it.
Yeah, so it very much falls into the quality, not quantity side of things with that as a technique. So as a little sort of practical point on it, in terms of the difference of load, so obviously you can lower more than you can lift. So how are you gauging how much weight's on the bar when for someone to lower before, relative to what they're capable of lifting?
Good question. So it varies from person to person, but our ability to handle more weight on the eccentric, it can be anywhere from 20 to even 40% more than what we can handle on the concentric. So it's going to, you kind of have to play it by ear a little bit for the person to start off a little bit lighter, kind of get them to their max end range. But if we're just saying around 30% is kind of the average there, what I usually like to aim for is take a weight that they can handle around 12 times typically. So something that they would do for higher reps for double arm.
Right.
Okay. Let's say if they're doing a seated row and that person can hit 100 pounds for maybe, 10 to 15 reps, that's probably going to be a good range for them to be able to do the concentric with 2 arms. And lower single arm, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be really tough, but they'll probably still be able to have solid control over it on the eccentric. So that's usually the rep range I like to use as a ballpark.
Nice, that's a really useful practical takeaway for people. Brilliant. Okay, and so now deviating back towards the biomechanics side of things and exercise mechanics and how the eccentric isometrics are helping that. How important do you think correct exercise mechanics is to people's results?
I think it's absolutely critical, and I think it's one that we're unfortunately seeing downplayed a little bit right now. I think that there's this trend in the industry that, there's no such thing as right mechanics or right technique or, right posture or good posture or bad posture. Everybody can move the way they want to. Everybody's, is different. So, there's individual differences. Just let them move however they want, even if they have valgus collapse. Oh, it's all good. Obviously, I think some of those proponents of that will take it to the extreme, making it sound like people such as ourselves who are maybe more into the biomechanics are suggesting that, you do one bad rep and you're going to have to take a trip to the hospital and get a, double ACL, reconstruction or something. That's obviously not the case. It's not instantaneous where you blow something out, but it's a buildup over time. You can do a lot of stupid things for a very long time until it catches up to you. So, and sometimes for some people who are more sensitive, my body's pretty sensitive. If I start doing things wrong, I can start noticing literally that session. Some people can get away with it for weeks, months, even years. But one thing I have seen time and again, it catches up to everyone. And just because it didn't create an acute injury or, take them out of the game for 3 months because something severe happened, that chronic buildup of inflammation, as we talked about, that's huge. And that can impact the whole body. So we can make it actually a pretty strong argument that poor body mechanics can trigger inflammation, which there's research suggesting that's the case. And that inflammation can affect our entire physiology, not just our, athletic performance, but it can affect our health. It can affect, how often we're getting sick, our immune system function, our hormones, even everything from allergies is kind of related to inflammation. So, it's kind of, some people think it's far-fetched to start connecting the dots, but in reality, it's not, because there's enough research to, if you really go at it, and this is one of the things I try to do in my book, Movement Redefined, is try to connect the dots, try to show how actually body mechanics, it's not just, it's great for athletic performance because the person's more efficient. It goes so much deeper than that. It's so much more profound that even it kind of blows me away when I go back and look at the research. Like, man, that is just crazy how the human body, how it works. When it's healthy, when it's doing things right, when the muscles are functioning properly, everything functions better. When the muscles aren't doing their job, everything starts breaking down, not just the joints, but overall health. So it's pretty wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I think, inflammation's a huge factor, something that seems to be getting focused on more, at least now. People are aware of it, but, potentially a bit of a silent killer. But in terms of your progress in the gym, a healthy body is obviously going to be a much better place to actually make gains from, as opposed to fighting essentially what's an uphill battle if you're not not in a good spot and you're chronically inflamed. So I think I completely agree with you there. And also the importance of exercise mechanics, I think, is huge, because if you think of it on a rep by rep basis, if your mechanics are on point, you're getting more from every rep. And if you're getting more from every rep, you're getting the stimulus, but also there's less reps required to get that outcome, and less risk of injury and less wear and tear on the joint. So you sort of, I see you nodding along there, so that's good. I'm glad you're agreeing with that. But yeah, I think it's odd how people discount that factor. It's kind of pretty much a fundamental principle as far as I can tell. Your programming can be great, but if your execution of the lifts is poor, you're not going to get the outcome you want.
Exactly. No,
So,
I think. Oh,
no. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add on to that. I think that's a huge thing. It's not just I'm lifting with better form. You're actually basically triggering a stronger hypertrophy response, and also to go hand in hand with that. If we look at, especially for natural lifters, how to maximize hypertrophy, kind of one of those indirect ones is really optimizing your neuromuscular efficiency.
Mm-hmm.
How well can you dig into those higher threshold motor units? How well can you maximize activation signals and recruitment signals? And how well can you kind of minimize those inhibition signals that would shut muscles off? Well, that goes back to technique. The more efficient our technique is, the more we can, overload a muscle without our body shutting down, because it starts to go into this protective situation where it wants to basically keep us from handling those weights. So when we're neuromuscularly efficient from having better technique, we can overload more, and as a result, we get more growth.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant. Actually, interesting point. So in terms of, you've obviously got a great background in biomechanics. Where did you learn all this stuff from? Presumably it wasn't just from going in the gym and lifting yourself.
Yeah, no, that's where I did my my PhD. That's really where I started looking at that, when I was at the University of Georgia, and looking at kind of how the biomechanics and the neurophysiology and structural physiology kind of play together. It's not just, let me look at one area and that's all I'm going to focus on. If we actually look at all those different fields of kinesiology, we can actually start to kind of put it together. And this is what I did with the whole eccentric isometrics. I kind of deconstructed, so to speak, what entails optimal movement in terms of, the biomechanics, the neurophysiology, the structural physiology. And then I kind of reconstructed that and said, okay, how do we put that back together into a training system to optimize those different physiological and biomechanical components? And it really is as simple as, slowing things down, using proper technique on the eccentrics, and that's kind of, it optimizes everything, so to speak. It kind of is where everything fits into this puzzle.
Okay. So, and then all of this is covered like in detail in your book, right? So.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, perfect. So well worth the read. Now, a little side point. You mentioned about foot position on the squat earlier, and it's probably worth getting it because I'm discussing that, because I'm sure there's a few people were scratching their head wondering about that. So can you talk us through foot position on the squat and how your take might be slightly different to a few people on that?
Yeah, one area that I rarely paid attention to this up until I started my PhD. And it wasn't just because you hear about all this. So, some people are doing the barefoot training trend. I actually kind of just disregarded it, so to speak, because I just thought it was another fitness fad. But when you start looking again at the research, foot and ankle activation is absolutely critical. And this kind of can tie into even everything that we were talking about, from biomechanics and muscle activation to even muscle growth. I've seen some pretty crazy things where you get an athlete to start firing their feet and ankles, and they actually start developing a bigger quad sweep because they're actually able to fire things up the kinetic chain, and then trying to activate the glutes and hamstrings, get the posterior chain going. It's almost impossible unless you're firing your feet and ankles. You can't do it. Activation begins with the feet and ankles, and that's how we get that signaling. So one of the things I've liked to try to do over the years is see, okay, what are the things that we can do to optimize those foot and ankle mechanics and foot and ankle activation? I've played around with so many variations, and not just of foot and ankle stuff, but of all the eccentric isometric stuff. And I experimented to no end with myself, and even with to an extent with clients with their permission. Obviously, back when I was at UGA, and even having people come into the lab. But from what I've found, and if you actually start looking at some of the biomechanics, and you cannot prove this one way or another, I think it'll always be impossible to prove a lot of these things, but you also have a difficult time saying that it's not correct, is that straighter foot position, that relatively straight foot position, it really helps to screw the foot into the ground. It really helps create optimal alignment, and it helps produce those better neural signals up the kinetic chain. And you can see it have an impact even on the squat when the person keeps their feet relatively straight. What ends up happening is they're actually able to set their hips back better, because if you think about it, if we go one extreme and we say, okay, let's really externally rotate those feet and hips, kind of like a ballet dancer doing like a plie squat. Well, what happens? Essentially our hips start to come forward. We start to move too much into a posterior an anterior direction with the hips when we're trying to go into the eccentric phase of a movement. Okay, so if I can't set my hips back on the eccentric phase of a movement, I'm essentially minimizing my posterior chain activation, and I'm also not able to squat with optimal mechanics. As soon as we straighten the toes out, the hips set back and our feet screw into the floor. It also creates a tighter position. And people think, oh, tight is no good. No, tight is good. That creates muscle tension, muscle stiffness, and that's actually what optimizes proprioception. And so we create this kind of spring-loaded, high-tension squat where we end up feeling the natural stopping point better, and we don't feel like we can just excessively keep going down, down, down. It's like, where's that natural stopping point? Well, the foot position helps to guide that.
Okay, interesting, cool. So you mentioned sort of relatively straight ahead as opposed to like having to be perfectly straight ahead. How many what's the range you're working in there? To give someone a guide if they feel a little bit more comfortable with their foot slightly externally rotated, that's cool. Or you'd say no, try and keep them pointing right ahead.
I used to say anywhere from 0 to 10, maybe 15 degrees. And over the years, the more I work with athletes, the more I work with clients, I've actually narrowed that down to about 2 to 5 degrees, or 0 to 2 to 5 degrees, just because every time, and it still kind of surprises me, you see stuff with a client, they say, feel some stuff here, and it's like, okay, they're maybe pointing their toes out a little much, but okay, maybe it's natural for them. And then all of a sudden, okay, let's see what happens when we just get a little bit straighter, and all of a sudden things improve. So I would have thought, if you would have told me 10 years ago, I would have become more lenient over the years working with more people. It's actually the opposite. I've become a little bit more stringent with that, because I've seen how impactful it is. It's not something that I just kind of randomly pull out of thin air. Oh, we're going to keep the feet straight just because it looks cool, or it just, from what I've seen, it makes a massive difference, even as much as just a few degrees. So it doesn't have to be perfectly straight, especially on something like a squat, but it's going to be pretty darn close to it. And on single leg movements, it's always going to be straight, because you can't really make a good argument for keeping an externally rotated foot or a toe flare on a single leg exercise. But on a squat, wide stance RDL, a little bit of room there, but not too much. Yeah.
So, I mean, to be honest, by the sound of things, visually almost imperceptible for most people that, it's that narrow a range. So if they can really see their feet are pointing sort of east and west, then they're way too far. Okay, cool. Well, so definitely something for listeners to try and experiment with and see how they find that, and if their performance increases as you said. So a nice little takeaway for them to have a go with there. We're kind of getting up on time here, so I just want to get us through last little bit before we give you an opportunity to tell everyone where they can find a bit more about you. So first of all is a quick fire round. So it's basically an either or. So there's a few questions here. So kick that off with pizza or burger.
Oh, burger, man. The protein, you got the creatine in the meat. Shoot, definitely.
Good shout. Chocolate or peanut butter?
Oh, chocolate, man. The dark chocolate. I can get hooked on that.
Fair play. Beach holiday or city break?
Ooh, beach, man. I like the peace and serenity.
And then last one is, so if you're having a steak, is it rare or well done?
Oh, definitely more on the rare side, man. Like I said, the creatine, you don't want to cook it out.
No one's ever said anything other than rare, to be fair. Although a new one, as I was saying, that one's popped in my head. It's not on the list, but we'll do it anyway. Okay, eggs, scrambled or poached?
Oh, probably scrambled, but I like them always. So probably scrambled, yeah.
Okay, that was the closest one we had you to not knowing. All right. Okay. So next up is, can you tell the listeners something they probably don't know about you?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Something they don't know about me. Shoot, man. I'm actually kind of a boring guy, unfortunately. I spend so much time working, and I don't have much of a life right now. I guess hopefully in a few years, if you ask me that question, I'll be able to tell you. I skydived out of a building. I did all these adventures. I travel the globe right now. It's been a little bit one-dimensional. Even to dating back to school, it's just I've been kind of on this go, go, go. It's been very much a career oriented path. I guess, this, they could find this out in the book, but I've had a lot of injuries over the years. If you want something interesting about myself, it's just things that I had to overcome with. So that's kind of how I developed some of these training systems. So as far as anything fun, shoot, man, I like good movies, good action films. So I don't know what else. Like I said, I'm kind of a boring guy, unfortunately. So
so we'll have to check back in like 5 years' time to see if you're on your round the world tour, bungee jumping.
The world's most interesting man, like that one commercial, go from the
yes, exactly,
man. That's funny.
All right, so next one is if I could interview anyone in the world, who should I interview next?
Ooh, oh man, I think Arnold is I know it's kind of a stereotypical one, but man, I'd love to just chat with him. He's just between the bodybuilding background, the movie and entertainment background, even the political side of things, man, that guy is loaded with knowledge and information. I think he would just be such a fun guy to talk to and chat with. And then I'd probably have to go with Stallone very closely after that. I'm a big Arnold and Stallone fan. Unfortunately, they're kind of, hitting their later years of life, and you don't see as many strong action figures like that as you used to. But those two guys are definitely. I still love watching their movies.
Yeah, me too. I love those growing up. If I had to go, I'll go with you. Like Arnie would, he'd sneak it over Sly. But they'd both be good guests. I mean, if they're listening, guys, I'm happy to have you on. So now we covered all the topics in terms of interviewing and getting your insights into training. So now I'm sure people are thinking they'd like to know a little bit more and go a bit deeper into things. So please take a moment to let everyone know how they can discover a bit more about you and the services you offer.
Yeah, so definitely just check out my website, advancedhumanperformance.com. I got, pretty much everything on there, from different articles, more about me and my services, my books, my programs. People always ask me, because I have a decent amount of programs and products they can look at on my website, kind of what are the two big ones or a few big ones that they had to take away. Obviously, my new book, Movement Redefined, it's over 600 pages. It's goes very, very deep into not just eccentric isometrics, but everything related to, muscle function and physiological function and how it affects, performance and health and so many more things than we even thought of. But it also has like 30 plus eccentric isometric training programs that go along with it. And then my foot and ankle manual, I think, is another big one. We just talked about the foot and ankle training. So I think that one, those two, I think if people get those and they really study them, I think it would really help them to master their body mechanics to another level and get to that next stage in their training.
Fantastic. All right. So everyone go out, check those out, educate yourself and learn a little bit more. And Joel, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us today. It's been brilliant.
Thanks so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
That wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for investing your time with us. We really appreciate it. If you enjoyed what you heard and took value from it, please do me a favour by heading to iTunes right now, subscribing to the show and leaving a review. Positive reviews, like 5 stars, hint hint, really help the ranking of the show and will help us to spread the word and keep getting top class guests on. Make sure to follow Breaking Muscle on social media and me at Tom McCormick, that's TOMMACCORMICK on Instagram. Bye for now, and I'm looking forward to catching you on the next episode of the Breaking Muscle podcast.